Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, How to Build an Engaged Community of Learners at a Global Company. I'm Claude Werder, Senior VP and Principal Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and I'll be your moderator today. Let's start with some introductions. Our presenters today are Chantelle Nash, Director of Digital HR Experience for Baker Hughes. They're a leading energy technology company. Hi, Chantelle.
Hi, everyone.
And Todd Moran, Chief Strategy Officer for NovoEd.
Greetings, Claude and all.
So we want to take a minute to thank NovoEd for sponsoring our webinar today. They're a great partner, and they were founded at Stanford Social Algorithms Lab in 2012. They're a capability building platform that uses social and collaborative learning to drive alignment, performance, and mobility at scale. Through cohort-based experiences, NovoEd taps into collective wisdom, placing each learner at the center of perspective, application, and expertise. Large enterprises such as 3M, GE, and Nestle partner with NovoEd to accelerate their critical initiatives and reconnect teams through learning that is felt, experienced, and swiftly transformed into impact. You can visit them at www.novoed.com. For those of you who aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we're a research and advisory firm. We empower excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program. Visit certification.brandonhall.com to learn more about how to earn that designation or any of our other certifications. Your participation in Brandon Hall Group's research surveys is one of the most crucial components of our insights and thought leadership. So if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics here that you can take a survey for, greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout as well, or you can also visit brandonhall.com. All participants receive a piece of complimentary research once results of surveys are analyzed. And finally, a few logistics. To ask questions, please use the questions panel on your control bar. We'll leave time at the end for questions and may take some during the presentation as well. The webinar is being recorded today. We will share a link to the recording and a PDF of the presentation via email in roughly 24 hours. But if you'd like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, the link will also be available shortly in the chat. Chat's also open for today, so we invite you to join in on today's discussion. Let us know what's going on in your organization regarding social learning and collaborative learning. Share your thoughts as we go through. We'll try to include some of them, or just simply pop in, say hello, and let us know where you're joining from today. So let's go over our agenda before we get started. We hope to share with you today three main things. First, sharing how to build a global learning delivery and experience tech stack to align employees to an organization strategy with each other. Create and deliver various experiences from self-guided learning to live virtual events and social networking. And this supports employees' continuous development. And also demonstrate the measurable and meaningful impact of communities of continuous development to build the learning suite. Let's start by explaining why we think this is such an important topic. So I'm sure it comes as no surprise that talent retention is top of mind for most employers in learning and HR functions. In fact, talent retention is #1 overall among people strategies in 2023, according to our research. We asked survey respondents, who are mostly business leaders and HR leaders and professionals, what they considered the most critical drivers for reducing talent risks. And these are the top 3. They all revolve around connection and belonging. So there's a greater sense of belonging, more collaboration, better connection between leaders and their team members. All revolve around connection and belonging. All can and should be, in our opinion, be addressed through social and collaborative learning. They're tremendously effective in knocking down silos and creating communities. Collaboration and continuous learning communities are also critical for future business success, our research shows. In our study about transforming learning for the future of work, conducted late last year, almost 3/4 of employers who were surveyed said collaboration is a critical skill for future success, and 70% said building communities that promote continuous learning virtually drives employee engagement and positions organizations for success. And as you'll see here on this slide, it's clear that most organizations really need help in driving engagement. Only 26% of organizations surveyed said their employees are highly engaged. For years, our research has shown that building continuous development opportunities plays a big role in increasing engagement and reducing voluntary turnover. Unfortunately, there remains this huge gap between the importance that organizations believe learning has on improving business outcomes and the actual effectiveness of how the learning is delivered. So 62% of people we surveyed said L&D is really important for this. Only 22% believe that learning is as effective as it should be. So there's still, in our opinion, too much reliance on learning events and knowledge delivery over practical application and continuous learning. Earlier this year, we asked employers to rate the most effective learning modalities for impacting business outcomes. And as you can see, instructor-led training and e-learning are nowhere to be found toward the top of the scale. Social learning and peer-to-peer collaboration ranked at the top, just 1 percentage point below coaching. The trend in learning is clearly around interaction, collaboration, and application. And the effectiveness ratings for social and peer-to-peer collaborative learning have increased faster than any other modality since 2020 in our research. And not surprisingly, considering that effective rating I just showed you, social learning and collaboration platforms ranked #1 among learning technologies likely to be purchased or licensed in 2023. So it's against that backdrop that we introduced Chantelle, who again is the Director of Digital HR Experience at Baker Hughes. Chantelle and her teammates have developed what we see as an excellent next practice for building and sustaining a culture of continuous learning. Baker Hughes earned a Gold Excellence Award in 2022 from Brandon Hall Group for CORE, the company's community-based experience, which is part of what Chantelle will share with us today. And as I mentioned earlier, Todd, Chief Strategy Officer for NovoEd, which is partnered with Baker Hughes, will also be adding his insights. Chantelle joined Baker Hughes in 2020 to support the digital learning transformation, creating a strategic roadmap and partnerships to develop the learning technology ecosystem, focusing on user experience. Since joining, she's successfully supported the transition of design and operations for several leadership programs, other programs, to a virtual approach, and has worked to optimize the global learning intranet experience. So Chantelle, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Claude. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me here. And yeah, I'm really excited to jump in here and talk about what we've been doing with both Brandon Hall and NovoEd. So we all know the ecosystem today impacting work it's always been changing. And the most recent thing that we all refer to is COVID, of course, but everything that you see across here on this slide has impacted the way that we work, from the context of work. And I won't read through each of these bullets, but you can kind of see from the context of work being more entrepreneurial, digital, of course. And one that I love to highlight on here is consumerized, which I'll talk more about throughout this presentation. The organizations themselves are becoming complex, distributed culture, how organizations are structured, and the culture that becomes from having a horizontal structure, simplifying organizations and simplifying culture as a result. From an HR perspective and how HR professionals interact with employees and the organizations they support, again, dealing with things like gig economy and turnover for employees that don't stay with companies very long, engagement, as you saw on the previous slides. Skills themselves have a shorter and shorter life cycle every day. The half-life of a skill, there's different numbers out there, anywhere from 2 to 5 years, you could say, but it varies, of course, depending. But skills have to be refreshed, and new skills are emerging every day. The kids of the world today are going to be in jobs that don't even exist yet in the future. So that's the type of thing you also have to manage. And then employees themselves becoming more dispersed geographically, more diverse generationally, and then of course overloaded with all of that information that they're getting in the world. So the takeaway here is that for learning to be essential, it has to be global, if you have a global organization, digital, simple, and sustainable. We can, yeah, there we go. So here's what we need to evolve. We have essentially 3 pillars that we center around when we think about the evolution, and it's people and culture, content, and the technology and data. And essentially what this means is everything from, when I talk about a consumerized approach, this is really what I'm thinking about, because it's everything from the people to communications, obviously the content of what you're connecting people to, scaling, reaching, how you measure is huge. And that's something I'm also very passionate about, is moving away from the traditional, did people complete these? What was the number of butts in seats? And then also the tech stack, and becoming more modern as far as what does the employee journey look like wing to wing across multiple systems, not even just the learning systems. But we obviously a lot of times have to start with the learning ecosystems. You can go to the next slide, Claude.
Yeah, it's Chantelle, with this idea, as you speak about evolution at Baker Hughes, we think about a lot across our install base of L&D as an entity also having to evolve, and what was wildly effective in sort of traditional modalities, 10, 15 years ago of ILT based, bringing folks together, was incredibly powerful to sort of communicate and transfer skill, really challenging to scale. And I think you've witnessed this firsthand as many others. So it sort of brought about this advent of self-directed by its very nature, sort of LXPs, and this huge promise of we'll make access to these large, voluminous content libraries. We'll let people sort of be their own CLOs of a sense, and they can just do self-directed. Scales incredibly well, but I think we buried folks in content, and long thought that the idea of equating basically consumption to mastery, or content equal learning, it equals learning. It doesn't, and I think this is a lot of what you've evidenced in some of the research that Claude showed at the outset, this idea of wanting to be not episodic or intermittent, but this continuous component. And whether it looks like that third column of a capability academy, or it's just this idea of social collaborative and bringing back the human element, which I think we've had a little bit of fodder in chat about folks saying there's a critical need to sort of address that sort of human component. And it's to scaling, like you mentioned about, it's to the criticality of interacting with sort of peers, mentors, managers, not just content assets. And this idea of what's the aim? Can we make these folks more performant ready more quickly in role when the half-life of skills is continuing to sort of reduce in that sense. So just a little bit about sort of how we're seeing the point of view, but I love where you took it at Baker Hughes, where you're putting employee centricity at the center of everything. I think you're doing, which is, if I'm not mistaken, that's a huge part of the course you've charted, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is to go into detail about some of those areas that we talked about in the categories. I did break out data and technology, but if you just follow the flow here, people and culture, we put people in the center, we put employees in the center of everything that we do. From a data perspective, having data sets that are connected, data lakes, so that decisions can be made in a more intelligent way and a seamless way, and then visualizing all of that together. One other thing that I talk about a lot is data, and educating on how to interpret data is such an important skill for us as professionals in our organizations, because even if you have the right data that's being captured, interpreting it is a whole other thing. And especially if you don't have combinations of data. So you might have a platform where maybe you're getting, you see every employee in the company has hit. And so from a numbers perspective, a traffic perspective, seems great. Well, if you combine that with some qualitative data and some sentiment analysis, maybe all of the employees are going to the platform and having a bad experience. Maybe they're not returning to the platform. So you have to combine various sets of data to tell a full story, and you constantly have to be keeping an eye on what is impacting that. Just as a quick example for that, we could have a whole other presentation on that. But then content, of course, programs, resources, being best in class. Again, there is a lot of information, like Todd mentioned, people getting overloaded with it, and also just not knowing what's actually worth it, what's not. Even learning teams, you've probably experienced when you're trying to curate, it takes a lot of time for your curation teams to go through and understand what's actually a valuable resource and what's not. And of course, accessibility is a big thing with the content too. Then technology, integrating systems, having a tech stack that makes sense together, again, between learning systems, but also across other systems from employees in the company. And the AI, machine learning, all, hot topics as far as AI goes today, and having that premium user experience. We're used to technology in our everyday life and having apps that work seamlessly. So when we come into organizations and, things are still clunky, or people are still using LMSs as LXPs, that becomes something that causes a lot of friction with employees and makes it harder for that adoption, engagement, and essentially results to occur. So you can go to the next slide. And the biggest part about creating a good experience, sometimes they're quick and dirty is something that there's a place for that too. It can be valuable, but overall, creating an experience that is valuable is because of this. And if you actually start at the right side of this, in order to create the culture you want, culture is driven by behavior, behavior is driven by emotion, and emotion is created by experience. And we can attest to that. And again, think of your favorite brands and the types of experiences they create that then make you a loyal customer. And those are the types, that's the path that you'll likely find following. So digital employee experience strategy, DEX, is kind of the acronym for that, or what am I trying to say? The short form of that. But you have your organizational tech alignment. We've talked about digital adoption support. So things like having walkthroughs, contextualized assistance, the data insights, and then communication. I also talk about marketing being a skill set for learning teams, for HR teams, anything that you're doing to interact with an employee and trying to get that adoption and show a value proposition, to educate. Those are all things that marketers do for products. And if you think about your platforms and you think about even your experiences themselves and the brand, your learning brand as a product, there is so much that can be applied from those spaces to create those engaging elements of your learning strategy. So those are all the things to kind of think about. So there's a quote there. You guys can grab that later.
Okay, so now we want to just take a break and get your involvement here with a quick poll. We've talked a little bit about some of the research and what Baker Hughes has begun to do, and Chantelle's going to drive into it more. But first, we want to know whether your organization has a digital engagement strategy for the full employee lifecycle. So 4 options for you. Yes, you do, and it's well developed, working well, really happy with it. Yes, but we're in the early stages, still getting our feet off the ground. C, no, but we're working toward building one. Or D, no, and this is really not in our plans. So we just want to get a sense of where you all are. And Melissa, who's working behind the scenes today, Melissa Benavides, our operations director, has launched it. And if you can just give us your answer, we'll take a quick look at where you're all coming out. It's always interesting to see where people are in their journey.
Chantelle, I wonder if it would help folks for you to paint a little bit of candor about what existed at Baker Hughes before you arrived and how instrumental you were about bringing this about at the organization as folks respond.
Yeah, so it was interesting because before Baker, I had spent about 10 years at GE, and we built a learning experience platform in-house. And that was a really awesome and enlightening experience. I learned a lot. And so coming to Baker Hughes, for those who don't know, had been acquired by GE in the past and then was being divested when I joined. And as a result, we had to start over with all of our platforms, from the LMS to HRIS systems. Everything had to be re-implemented. And so it was like going back in time, and just the organizational structure of Baker, even from how employees interacted with each other, there was a lot of work to be done. So starting from there, and on one hand, having a canvas to implement some strategy, but also being very limited in terms of, needing to do things very quickly to keep the company going where they needed to be in that short amount of time, and back on their feet, and all those kinds of things were all challenges that we had to work through. And yeah, we'll touch on some of those for sure in more detail.
All right, let's see where we are with results. So it seems like the majority, about 64%, do not have an engagement strategy. About 32% are working toward one, and 32% are not really planning on working on them. 11%, congratulations to the 11% that believe they have a really good engagement strategy going on. And then 26% say they're in early stages. So this is really helpful, I think, to understand where you are. And I think hopefully we're going to be able to provide information that can help you move forward wherever you are in your journey. So Chantelle, I'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect. So I mentioned earlier about analyzing data and how you measure things. And I am a huge proponent of ROE, ROX, which is return on experience. Sometimes I've seen it as ROE squared, which is return on engagement and experience. Again, speaking to that engagement component. But I usually position this higher than ROI, because we all know in the learning industry that connecting learning to ROI, while you can do that for some technical training and some very specific, outcomes or behaviors that maybe you can measure for a specific type of skill or activity, when we do things like leadership learning and culture change, those are all very hard things to say, oh, because we provided leadership training to all of these people or provided this experience, we are tying this to revenue. That does not mean there's not value, and that there's not value you can prove for engagement and experience. And what I like about this chart is it shows the whole flow of how providing a good experience for your employees on the left side, so that's the internal service quality, your employee satisfaction, how that then does this domino effect that does ultimately impact the ROI of the company. The ROI of your initiatives, and then like revenue for the company, value for the company. So you have employee satisfaction, which leads to employee retention and productivity. When your employees are happy and productive, then they're providing better external value in the value chain. And then there's better customer satisfaction, because the products you're putting out and the employees behind those products and services are doing better. And so your customers are happier. And then that creates more loyalty, and that creates more revenue growth and profitability of a company. So this is something that, while it can be very difficult to say, A equals B for some of these things, showing this to really say, maybe we focus on some of these parts in the middle and measuring those, it's almost like it's positioning it as the cost of doing nothing. Maybe we aren't able to prove that I, implemented a piece of training or a community or an experience, and it resulted in, X, millions of dollars in revenue growth, but I can show some metrics on how satisfied our employees are, maybe some turnover rates. And that is something the company should care about, because that will ultimately impact these other things down the line. So this is just a highlight of that type of thinking. This is just another kind of breakdown of the elements of this. So things like creating influencers in your organization that drive behaviors and then drive outcomes, and creating loyalty. That's kind of just the cycle of things through here. So you can use this as reference, again, just to kind of highlight some of those pieces in that value chain. Now, this is a little bit deeper view of the actual KPIs that you can use in this process. So when we talk about things like employee satisfaction and commitment, when you look at that from a content and platform perspective, you can get a lot of insights from that. Things like, how are things being rated? All the social features that, again, are used kind of in the consumer world. Sometimes in organizations, leadership feels like that is inappropriate or maybe too informal for what you're trying to do, but it's actually really insightful to get an understanding of what they call that social sentiment. How are things being rated? Even if from a degree, allowing comments or reviews on those types of things is really helpful. Correlations, I kind of alluded to this before. So return visits, how much time are people spending on things? Overall consumption data can be really insightful. And then of course, employee NPS related to digital experiences. One reason I don't like NPS scores in isolation is because it doesn't tell you the why, right? You'll get the idea of, do they recommend it, which is great. But you don't know why they would recommend it or why they wouldn't. And so again, kind of triangulating those data sources is important. From a productivity standpoint, this is everything from finding out how long it takes for people to find what they're looking for. And this can be done both through digital metrics and platforms, but also just some analysis of process flows and things like that. reduce time to learn a skill. This kind of goes back to, do I really need to take an hour-long e-learning course, or do I just need to watch like 5 minutes of a YouTube video and I can still be effective in what I'm doing? And time and effort to manage processes, so administrative type stuff, reporting, how quickly can we get the data, how quickly can we visualize data, or does it take us a long time to get it all put together and to get the insights we need? Those are all things that you can have as value propositions to creating better experiences. Organizational development and sustainability. Search indicators. What are people searching for? There's leading indicators that are really important for you to constantly look at to predict where you might need to go next. And that's where I'll kind of draw your attention to this quote in the upper right as well that I didn't touch on yet. But ROX, so return on experience, is less about implementing best practices. Not that you don't do that, of course you do, but it's also about creating the next practice. So those leading indicators, looking at how should you be adjusting, how can you get to the point of making things even better, is really an important element of that. And then simplification. So of course, how can you find ways to just look at some solutions that you can achieve some of these things that may already be in place. So this is where we started looking at how can we do some of this inside of Baker Hughes, with a big focus on not just teaching people some skills, but transforming the culture of Baker Hughes, especially because of the divestiture from GE, things like moving a lot of our folks to remote with COVID, even a history of Baker Hughes before GE even. The company had a lot of opportunity in this area. So we created a community that was called CORE. It focused around the 4 Baker Hughes values, and it was we very intentionally made it a community on the behaviors we need to align to that strategy. We can go to the next slide on that one. So this is a lot of information, but I just wanted to highlight on here that we focused, again, CORE had all of these elements aligned to it that were part of the strategy, how it's structured, the change management piece, talent rewards, talent assessment, and then all of the elements kind of on the outside in bullets. We looked at how is it structured? How are we communicating? How are we rewarding behaviors within this type of experience? So we used this, which was a broader cultural model, to really inform how we designed this community from a continuous perspective for leadership development. Again, a lot of information on the page, but we've got on the left, what were the things we considered, and on the right, what we ended up doing to deliver on that. And so at a high level, you have the remote hybrid workforce. We've got prioritization of development, where before this, developing leadership behaviors wasn't something that necessarily even appealed to the audience within our company, or with leadership in some cases. Promotions to leadership were occurring maybe with limited prior leadership development, maybe out of necessity, maybe because somebody's good at their technical job and then they get promoted to a leadership role, and then just not making time to develop. Lacking of focus, there wasn't any structured education around the values of the company. Employees were having to search various places, a disjointed experience to find information. And then our leadership development programs were product company or regionally driven versus having a central approach to that. And then programs were exclusive in some senses. So some employees may wanted leadership development, but they may not have been invited to get that opportunity to participate in one of those. So what we did, or our goals were to provide a flexible approach that we could scale, centralized, something that people could do with whatever amount of time they had, that they could do continuously. Intentionally, we made this opt-in. So one thing I really want to emphasize on this is we did not create an initiative where we said everybody in the company has to do this, or managers have to assign it, or anything like that. This was completely organically driven as far as participation goes. And that is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. That's another thing we could talk about, especially with most social initiatives. There is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And there's a lot of things that you can learn from a consistency perspective to grow that. And then curating a continuous learning experience. Again, we didn't want this to be learning as an event anymore. We also didn't want this to be in competition with face-to-face learning, because there's always this argument, right, about face-to-face versus virtual. We don't want to say one is better than the other. You need both, depending on the context. And even when you have face-to-face training, there should be a continual element of learning. It doesn't have to be formal. That's where the social aspect comes in. But how are you enabling truly ongoing learning? And this is where sometimes calling things learning can be part of the challenge, because we're learning every day. You might read something in passing and you didn't necessarily set aside that time and say, I'm going to learn in this 5 minutes, but maybe you did something that still you learned from. And I think creating, again, an experience that still allows people to benefit and learn and grow themselves is part of that strategy.
Chantelle, could I ask just a quick second to unpack that center call out? Because I think the idea of the opt-in, but you also combine that with accessibility to a broader swath across Baker Hughes. And I think that that's calling on a little bit, Claude, of the research of the democratization of leadership development, seeing that as a trend that sort of happened at the tail end of last year, heading into this year, was I think, purposeful by design, Chantelle, because that's pretty unique, I think, in terms of choice made there.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the opt-in element of that was very intentional, and something that we did. We made sure to promote it to everyone in the company. And this definitely, there are communication and engagement approaches we had to take to, and that we're still taking, right, to get it socialized across the organization as to what is this, why does it matter. So there's still a lot of change management around it, but it is something that is available and at scale for anybody who wants to do it.
Tremendous.
And another part of what we did in this community was creating this model of learn, engage, and deliver, which we now call our lead model, coincidentally. But you've got the learning portion, and on Claude's earlier slides, it talked about social is very important. It's not just the learning, and we've kind of combined all of this together. So we still do curate self-paced courses. It could be e-learning, it could be abstracts like book summaries that we have access to, it could be a TED Talk video. There are different things, different content libraries we have, and we do still curate those things. Then there's the engage portion. Well, I'll say first, the learn portion, they're curated, but again, employees are encouraged to go in whatever order or do as many or as few of them as fit for their personal situation. Then there's an engage element, which are live virtual sessions. We offer these at multiple times. They are typically not recorded because we do want to encourage people to attend live and engage. So we offer multiple days and times, but unless it's a really special event, we don't record any of them to encourage that community participation. And we have two different types of events. There's workshops that are more like a lunch and learn type of a thing. And then there are open mic sessions, which are truly, you have a topic, everybody comes, and there might be a little bit of an introduction to the topic, but then people share their different perspectives with each other, and it just kind of becomes a fireside chat, if you will. And employees are encouraged to actually submit to do their own open mic topics or to present if they would like. And then, of course, that just also provides more ways for you to connect with the community. Then there's the deliver portion, which is kind of like the application element of it, where they are encouraged to do you kind of consider it a project. There's a lot of different options, whether, again, they want to hold one of those workshops or an open mic on their own and facilitate that. They can do a case study. They can record a video of themselves teaching something back. There's a whole lot of things. They can be a peer or a coach to somebody and mentor somebody, and all kinds of things just to kind of apply and teach back what they've learned. So those are the three elements, the kind of activity categories we focus the learning around within the community. This is an example just to show the thought that went into how we actually implemented and launched this. So we had the concept of the community, but you can see just kind of based off of this timeline, the work that was done from kind of the change management side and engagement side, from having a live event at the very beginning of the timeline to doing campaigns with different partners throughout the company. So our HR business partners, our employee resource groups, different regional leaders, all of that kind of stuff to say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is the value, and trying to get some buy-in from those groups. We created a learning council that could be could represent different areas and could be a sounding board for different ideas. Then there were mini campaigns, email campaigns, social campaigns through our social channels. Just again, thinking like a marketer, a lot of people think, oh, we're going to launch something, we're going to advertise it to the whole company, and then that's it. And you truly have, and then they wonder like, oh, well, we got really good numbers at first, but then, it stopped growing. And so I always say consistency, consistency, consistency. Some people will debate, well, how should we promote it via email? But people are overloaded with email, but they also don't want another, they don't want another ping in Microsoft Teams and all of this kind of stuff. And the answer is it's a combination of everything. Different people have different preferences, and it's more the consistency in getting the message out in all of the different channels that your employees might use, and not doing it more than once. There's some Tony Robbins quote somewhere in the world about the number of touches it takes for something to stick in people's mind. And I'm not going to try to quote the number because I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a lot. It's not just, 3-5 times. Think about, sometimes you might get those things that stick out in your mind, the billboard you always see driving down the street or something. But, it's usually, even if you don't notice it right away, a lot of little things that stack up to get some recognition. So anyway, this is just stuff that shows the timeline and the different elements to give you an idea of how much strategy and planning actually has to go into this type of thing.
And so now we want to take just a couple of minutes to ask you one more poll question. And before I ask it, just want to remind people we will have time for questions. So feel free to put them in the questions or the chat as we go here, so we can get to them toward the end. And just drop in comments as well as what are your experiences? Chantelle's giving a really good description of everything she went through with her team. What are you experiencing? And we'd love to hear that as well. But our poll question here is just simply, please indicate which of these are present in your organization. We want to get a sense of, again, where you are. Select all that apply, or actually, no, we give you some options. So the first option is successful approach. Do you have a successful approach to learning tied into strategic business transformations? Number 2 is you have an inclusive learning culture. Number 3, continuous professional development opportunities. Then let us know if 2 of the 3 above are true, or all of the above are true in your organization. I guess it's possible that none of the above are true, but we're going to be optimistic and not give you that option. So we'll give you a couple minutes here to finish sorting through this question, see what you where you are, and then we can move on and keep driving into more detail. So Melissa, let us know what we got. Okay, so about 20% are doing all of these things, and another 32% are doing 2 of the 3. So that means over half are doing at least 2 of these 3 things. So all of these, I think, are really important to drive a continuous learning in your organization. So congratulations to those of you who are really all over this and really making progress. And we're going to talk a little bit more of all these things and how these things develop in a program like CORE as we go on here. So Chantelle, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. So another element that we implemented in our community is a badging approach. And this was for a variety of reasons that we decided to do this. One is there was an element of incentivizing employees. We didn't want people to feel like there wasn't something that they could get to show what they were investing in and the things that they were learning. And we found that badges and the ability to share badges in a public forum like LinkedIn, even if these things weren't publicly available for others outside of the organization, showcasing what people were doing was really important to them. And then, of course, from an employee brand, employer brand perspective and talent acquisition, it was something that we thought would be great to do, to show what is Baker Hughes doing to invest in our employees and grow our employees. The other element of this is providing some type of framework for those who, even though we're curating things and we're providing a community that has some structure in itself, some people still don't know where to start, and they're much better having kind of a pathway to follow. And while we encourage everybody to pick and choose what is most relevant to them, this allowed for us to create some criteria towards earning certain badges that someone could follow if they just really weren't sure where to start. And so we have 3 levels of the badges. One is the activity badges, which basically there's certain criteria for each of those pillars, the learn, engage, and deliver pillars, where again, it is not required. You don't have to do this. You don't have to earn a badge. If you're incentivized in that way, you're competitive and you want to, that's great. But we also just felt like, you don't fail, or you don't not pass core or get credit for things if you don't meet all the criteria for a badge. So those are at the activity level if you complete all the activities. And I actually failed to mention, so we have 4 values in Baker Hughes. And so how we structure the community is every quarter we focus on a different value. So every quarter there's different learn, engage, and deliver activities that helps keep everything fresh in the community and kind of focused on a certain thing, which also helps with the social and community aspect, because everybody, even though you're kind of picking and choosing the things that are more important to you as an individual, there is still an element of everybody is kind of going through in a cohort-based approach, looking at the same kind of topic and behaviors associated with those values each quarter. So the level 1 is the learn, engage, deliver activities. If you kind of meet the criteria that we set for those. Level 2 is if you've completed all of the activities in each 3 of the categories for each quarter. So that's kind of the quarterly level. And then the level 3 is if you complete all level 2. So if you get 4 level 2 badges, you complete all of the learn, engage, and activities for all 4 quarters, then you kind of get this holistic. Again, we don't like to call it a completion, because you can still continue in the next year and our content will refresh for the next year, but it does show that you've made a commitment for the whole entire year and gone through all of the activities that that were curated as part of that. So this was, we started core without a platform to really host it on. We used the tools we had at the time, and we'll get into what that looked like architecturally and how we moved into that. But essentially, we realized at some point having a platform that could optimize this whole experience was necessary for us to continue scaling it. So for the first year, we didn't have this, but then we embarked on this journey to implement the first virtual learning environment for cohort-based communities in Baker Hughes, which was NovoEd. So as part of the supporting resources, this is kind of showing what we're presenting to employees as ways that they can also help basically take forth and become influencers to help promote the community. So we have slides, we have FAQs, we have videos, animated videos that we created that kind of provided walkthroughs and screenshots, how-tos, how to get started, just things like how do you get info, how do you find announcements on the next upcoming events, things like that. And then of course, live event recordings for certain events that were more informational on how do you navigate the community.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Chantelle, because I think the reference that Claude made at the open about sort of this idea of moving away from sort of the fixed event type approach and this idea of continuous, in some ways being demanded of your employee base and what you want to put forward. We put high stock in that. And I think more and more this idea of moving to sort of continuous and the experience component being centralized to, what makes professional development for the modern learner really hum is this at its core. And I'd be interested to hear your take a little bit, but obviously we put a huge emphasis on the human centricity part of that, the human element component of that. And it's evidence in some ways, I think, by the opening data point you shared, Claude, around what's the preferred modality that is seeing sort of rocketing expansion. It's around coaching, mentoring, and peer-to-peer. Those are the 2 biggest ones. This expectation, and I wonder, Chantelle, if you would put it to this level, but 3+ years on into the pandemic, the need and desire for that human element has only increased, I think, in a really palpable way. And part two, and these might seem a bit sort of cacophonous in terms of conflicting with each other, but I heard you say it, where you're wanting to allow choice of folks inside of core in terms of their choice of modality or consumption or pathing, but then there's some prescription, right? Every quarter, you're asking this entity to move through at a certain pace in sort of in a directional entity. And I think that those two elements, the human component and then this balancing of choice and prescription, become really important of creating these experiences that are not simply pure play self-service, and they're not simply a VILT component, but it's a true experience. And I think there were some pretty significant elements that you wanted to weave into the nature of, okay, well, what did it really look like? What did it feel like to be part of core, which I think is where you're going to take us next.
Yeah, absolutely. That having a community and creating it in a way that feels like you're in one place was absolutely part of that. And so having this cohort-based platform that will allow for that feeling to happen is exactly why we wanted to implement NovoEd. And today we have this experience that provides easy enrollment. It has the modern user interface. There are curated learning paths so that everything is centralized, even if we are using several different sources of content. One thing that was also big that I think was on one of the previous slides just now was personalization. And the way that we were doing things before, there was content in our LMS and we were embedding that in a certain SharePoint site, and people could see all the things they had choices to do, but they couldn't. You could go to the LMS and get your transcript, of course, but that had everything that you've ever learned, not just what was being presented in the community. So having this actual space that would show an individual what their specific progress was in the community, just this community, not for all of their learning. There's technical training, compliance training, maybe there's just other stuff outside of these behaviors they were learning. This was showing the space of what we're doing in the community. And then the badge issuing also was something that we were able to automate through here, because we had we had thousands of people in the first year. In the chat, I mentioned we had about 5,000 people in the first year that just opted in to join, which again, for a company of, 50 to 60,000 people, you might not think that that's a lot, but again, these things take time, and really mature communities didn't get there overnight. And this was actually, when you look at growth rates, it was really good progress for us. And also to not having this automated, our admins were doing issuing of badges manually every quarter. So people weren't getting their badges automatically, like in real time. We were telling them, hey, at the end of each quarter, if you've completed all the requirements, we're going to go through, compile our data, which was also another element we'll talk about that was kind of manual and we had to automate. And then they would get their badges. So that was a really big optimization that we were able to get from NovoEd. And then analytics for facilitators as well. Obviously social and peer-to-peer features. I'll talk about kind of what we were doing in the previous model and kind of how that was optimized in NovoEd, but this is just a snapshot of some of those enhancements that we were able to achieve through this method. Again, this is a little bit about our process and how we did this, because I recognize that every organization has its challenges, and ours certainly did not come without those. And so we did have to create a business case, coordinate with several of our businesses to confirm that this would be a need and something that everybody agreed would be worth doing. And then we also have at Baker Hughes very robust DT, which is digital technology, processes, from cybersecurity, vendor onboarding. I know some of you will identify with this, but even for me, like Baker Hughes is very rigorous. And again, when you combine that with processes and resource constraints from the whole structural turmoil that has happened, there were just a lot of hoops to go through and make sure that we had all our ducks in a row, and being very clear about what this even is, to an extent, educating the organization on how does this fit into the tech stack? Why can't an LMS do what NovoEd does? There were those levels of conversations where, senior leadership in the organization, they're not learning professionals. So how do we make this make sense from a tech stack perspective? So that was a big piece. Leading the design work with NovoEd and with our design teams internally was another big piece. How do we translate how we had been designing this previously to a new tool. Some things had to change, some things, most of the things were changed for the better. Some things we had to be creative. In particular, because this is a continuous community and typically cohorts are gated with a start and an end date, there were some things we had to really get creative on. How do we create that experience that is continuous? And we were able to do that. But it took some time. And then testing. This was just again, a requirement of ours, but did really pay off in the end. We created over 800 functionality and content readiness test cases across 350 pages across the NovoEd instance that we created it was about 2 or 3 communities when we did our initial launch. So there was a very rigorous process associated with that. So this is just these next 2 slides are going to be really fun just to show you our before and after. We've genericized, obviously, just for the privacy of Baker Hughes, exactly the tools that we've used. But it'll give you an idea. If you look at basically just focus your eyes on the light green circles, squares, rounded squares on these different processes. So like if you look at step 1 and 2, this is how are people registering and getting into the community. Then you've got badge issuing. That's kind of at the end of the process, but right under that in step 7. You can see these are areas to the right. How are people signing up for events within the community? How are we then getting people's data to understand if they've met the badge requirements or not? This is just the complexity of the ecosystem we had and the tools that we were cobbling together, which is impressive in itself that we were able to do this. So if you don't have tools, it's possible. This is the portion that we won our Brandon Hall Award for last year, because we were able to create an experience with what we had with the community. But obviously this isn't the most optimized. So if we go to the next slide, this will then show the optimized architecture. And you don't have to be an architectural expert to see that this is much simpler than the slide before. And it's centralized with the power of NovoEd, with the integrations we were able to achieve, everything from the data that we're getting and the reports that we're able to get to how the content is embedded in the system. And then again, the personalization and having the user have one place to go, even if we're still using some other tools to support some things like our events are through Microsoft Teams, there's integrations for some of that. So it can by and large be all surfaced within NovoEd and then the user experience through NovoEd. So just wanted to show this as a really quick before and after of how we optimize using NovoEd. So as far as impact goes, just really quickly, we launched this in January. Just as far as interest and kind of initial engagement goes, I like to highlight that on the call out here on the little monitor where you see this Excel outtake, there's a lot of live learning events that we would hold, and we would track how many viewers that we were getting on each one. And the event that we did that promoted the launch of this community was the top viewed learning live event that we had done, aside from one, which was a live event that was done with the CEO of the company. So I think that's pretty good if we were only second to the CEO, and just kind of showed, I think, both the need and the interest that we had been working to create with this. The rest of it is kind of just some initial we had a pre-launch period where we did have to kind of shut down the experience, let people re-register for the new one if they had already been members of the community versus just kind of the new adopters going forward. And so even in the pre-launch period, before it was live, we had just over 1,000 people who said, hey, yeah, I want to make sure to go over into the new experience. And we did have greater conversion than that. But before it was even launched, we had that many people who at least said, hey, look, I want to be a part of this. So it has grown even more since then. Especially with NovoEd, but this is just kind of showing again, just very initial when you're starting an initiative, some things that you can look at to measure. Really quickly on this slide, this goes into I did do a specific project ROI analysis attempt. And what this is taking things like the cost of absenteeism for an employee, turnover rates, attrition, average cost to replace employees. We did do an analysis of that to say, if we make an assumption, and some of this was based off of industry averages that I had to research. So it could vary from company to company, of course, but just as a baseline, I took some of these numbers. I took Baker Hughes's revenue. I took kind of the average salary, just US based as a benchmark, because when you get into converting currencies and stuff, it's a little bit difficult. But just as a benchmark, took some of those numbers. The steps 1 through 7 kind of take the different the different data points that we did. And then you look at employee engagement value. If you can assume that you're increasing engagement and productivity by an average of industry percentage, that reduces absenteeism by a certain amount. You do some calculations based on your average employee salary and average cost in the industry that it takes to replace an employee, and then do some measurements and calculations based on your company's revenue. We came out to a business value of over $4 billion. Now, I was essentially laughed out of the room when I presented this to leadership, because it's wild, right? It's really wild. But even if you say that this is pie in the sky, right? If you take even a fraction of this value of something that you're implementing like this, you can't deny that that's still great value. So again, some of the math has to be fuzzy. Some of the things you have to say, how do you get from that point A to point B with what you're doing? But this shows that there is impact, even if it's only a fraction of it that you can correlate. And if you can get specific on these numbers for your specific company, then you have, obviously even a better business case.
Well, thank you, Chantelle. This was a great presentation. We've got a few minutes for questions. So I encourage people just to throw in a quick question or two that we'll try to get to. One question that came in that and I know about from working with you on this for the conference is, this is a very impressive program, and yet I know that you did not have a huge budget. So talk just a little bit, if you can, about the teamwork and the collaboration within your own team that went into making this work on, to get it up quickly and not having a lot of resources to work with.
Yeah, I think having teams that are very innovative and willing to experiment is critical to doing things like this. There are times when we didn't know the right answer, the teams couldn't agree on the right answer, but being able to work in a very agile way and experiment and see what happens, to be okay with if we did fail and we didn't get the results we wanted, so that we could more quickly get to the results you want. I think sometimes, especially with new initiatives, there is a lot of pressure to have it be successful, or you fear your funding or your resources are going to get taken away. But I think if you have that leadership support to say, we don't know how to do this the right way or what the best way to do it is, but you guys go ahead and figure it out. That's essentially what happened with this community, and I think was a big part of the success.
You mentioned also change management a couple of times, and I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the change management approach that you all had to engage in, to both internally within your team, and then to sell it to the overall organization.
Right. I think that, so there was a lot of appetite for this, but there is also a lot of cynicism around things like this, of course. So the change management in terms of how is this going to benefit the company, I actually saw from Gregory in the chat about kind of a question related to how much time did it take for people to earn badges, but also did that take away from doing their actual jobs, and was that ever an issue? There are different elements, there are different pockets of leadership that feel like, hey, our employees don't have time to do this, and it's taking away from their jobs and things like that. I wouldn't say that in our case we had any serious issues with it impacting anybody's ability to do their job. But from the leadership perspective, you do have to kind of bring them along into, again, what is the cost of doing nothing? What if your employee never does invest in any of this development, and then all of a sudden, you need something from them and they don't have the skills to do that, or maybe they don't feel like they're being invested in and developed, so they leave the company. Different things like that. Education, again, on how does this fit into the tech stack? Why can't we use additional tools? So definitely identifying your stakeholder groups from an employee perspective, a leadership perspective, your infrastructure support. I think one thing that I was really able to help do as a leader in this initiative was to connect the learning team with others in the organization to help them get to where they needed to go. Because I don't think that that bridge was really built in the past. And we eventually were able to get some things done more quickly than we ever thought we could because of that relationship having been built.
Well, I guess we'll have to leave it there. We're hitting 2 o'clock. I want to thank Chantelle. Thanks also to Todd. This was a great presentation. I love this program, not only for everything that Chantelle talked about, but the fact that it really does focus on the core values of the organization. And there really is an obvious business benefit to people participating in this. And I think a lot of times in learning, we struggle with that connection. And this connection was so obvious and so strong that I think that also add to its success. We want to thank you for taking the time today to join us. I know your time is valuable. We appreciate you. Thanks again to NovoEd and especially to Chantelle for all your work with this presentation. And we hope to see everyone on another Brandon Hall Group webinar very soon. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and the rest of your week. Bye-bye.